Welcome to the 6th episode of Chronsega, the uglier, slightly deformed younger sibling of Chrontendo. Today we start off in June 1988 and end up in October of the same year. We also have a few Western releases that I think came out in the second half of the year. Possibly. Big changes for the Master System in summer 1988. Suddenly, third-party developers appear. Not original games, but ports of arcade games from Taito, Irem, and Data East. Prior to this episode, the only big third-party name we've seen has been Tecmo. Sega themselves even contribute some decent action platformers. All in all, this is, I'd say, the strongest lineup of games we've seen yet for the Master System. Alright, we start this episode off exactly where we left off in Chronsega Episode 5, on June 2nd, 1988. And this is Lord of Sword, a rather awkward name. However, for the US release, they altered it slightly to Lord of the Sword. So here's the weird thing, remember Chronsega, the last game from Chronsega 5, released the exact same day as this? It played a slow, clumsy swordsman who was constantly getting pelted by much faster, more agile enemies. Well, your character in Lord of Sword is virtually the same guy, just sort of given a sword and sorcery makeover. In fact, Chronsega and Lord of Sword are very similar games. It's really quite strange that Sega would release two games that are so much alike on the same day. And oh yes, Lord of Sword does give you a pretty much worthless map. It doesn't tell you where you are. How are you supposed to use a map like that? Landau, and yeah, that's the guy's name, Landau, has some basic sword attacks, just like Kyoto from Chronsega. The crouching sword attack in particular look almost identical in both games. Naturally, enemies keep popping up and jumping at you, or often jumping over you, and then coming at you from behind. The fact that so many of them take multiple hits mean you will almost certainly take some damage in any given level. Now, one handy thing you do have is a bow and arrow. This can take out enemies from a distance, however, it actually takes a moment to pull it out and draw back the arrow, so it's really only good for stationary or very slow-moving enemies. Faster enemies would be on top of you before you had a chance to fire off an arrow. You get hints from NPCs such as this tree, or villagers, though the hints aren't really that helpful. Like, where is Nemo, for example? The map isn't labeled. Also, these guys will have a few different lines of dialogue, but you need to exit and re-enter the screen in order for them to speak a second time in order to hear everything they have to say. Okay, so I'll run off some of the peculiar things about Lord of Sword. As mentioned, it's hard to avoid damage, so you will die. But you can continue when this happens. In fact, this only puts you back at the beginning of the level that you died on with all your items intact. The game is built as a bunch of really short levels, so there's no serious consequences of dying as far as I know. Also, certain levels will offer connections to different levels. Here, for example, where you see that hill in the background, walking along the ground off the screen will take you to one level, but climbing up the hill will send you on another path entirely. The structure reminds me a bit of the Nintendo Rambo game. You have a series of horizontally linked screens with occasional intersections that allow you to cross over to a new area. Each village simply consists of a few houses and maybe one NPC that you can talk to. You refill your life bar by re-entering a house multiple times. There are a few items to collect, seen on the top right of the screen, so it has sort of a very simplified Zelda 2 or Castlevania 2 feel to it. As mentioned, Landau controls very sluggishly, and since each of the Master System's two buttons are used to fire a weapon, you have to jump by pressing up. So this guy makes Simon Belmont look sprightly by comparison. This is a boss-like character. You can obtain an item from him. It's a leaf. Not sure what it does. Game doesn't really tell you. So Lord of Sword is an interesting looking, scrolling hack-and-slash type game. I wish it was a little bit better. I liked it less than Chronsega even. If your character controlled better and the game gave you a bit more information about the game world, quests, and the items, that sort of thing, it would probably be a bit more fun. Hey, Super Racing! No, not Great Racing. Sega's already dropped the Great label on their games. Cool music though, and there's 2 different modes. We'll get to that in just a sec. Ah, look at the car names. Isn't that cute? So eventually you'll go through all the menus and whatnot and start the game. Each track has 2 parts, a practice run, where your time determines your place in the lineup, and then the real race. Not really sure what the difference between the 2 are. So as you can see, this is another one of those Japanese top-down racing games. We had a couple of these on the Famicom, like Nintendo's Famicom Grand Prix. These things never seem to make it outside of Japan for some reason. And I personally do find them a little annoying. They take some practice, you have to drive the track a couple times before you really sort of get the feel of it, since you can't really see ahead of you at all. The only indication of a turn are those arrows that appear on the ground. So after the practice we have the actual race, 3 laps in this case. As you can see, you can collide with the other cars. I guess you take some sort of damage, since there's a status screen and you can do a pit stop to repair, but I didn't really notice any decrease in my car's performance after the few collisions. Oh yeah, and let's go back to those 2 modes. The BGM mode is the one where there's background music playing. With the other mode, which is called the real mode, there's no music, just sound effects. The controls are pretty simple. One button accelerates, the other changes gears, you just have 2 gears. This is a decent little game, certainly more pleasing to the eye than any of the similar games on the Famicom. It's also, I guess, more pleasing looking than the Master System Outrun, which looked kinda flickery and whatnot. So it's not exactly state-of-the-art, but really not that bad either. Now here's the first in a series of several ports of non-Sega games. Captain Silver. Not exactly a top-tier arcade title, but for the Master System, you take what you can get. Captain Silver is a pirate-themed game, as you could probably guess, but your character is not Captain Silver. Nope, he's the bad guy. You are rather the Guybrush Threepwood-style adventurer who's out to find the legendary treasure of Captain Silver. The original Data East arcade game came out in '87, around the same time as Karnov. Like Karnov, it's a rather difficult ghost and goblin style game. It really isn't that memorable. For the Master System release, the colors were muted quite a bit. The arcade game had some pretty ugly colors, the hit detection was improved, and the entire thing made a bit more enjoyable. First level takes place in a quaint little fairy tale town with werewolves, witches, and pumpkins everywhere. There are various things to pick up, such as the boots make you jump higher. Occasionally fairies will appear. When they do, make sure you grab them, as this will power up your sword to fire projectiles. And this is the key to beating the game, having the powered up sword. That'll make certain parts go much smoother. Some rather hateful platforming is tossed in here and there. Yep, landing in the fountain will kill you. Who knows why? You collect gold as you go along, and when you find a shop you can buy power-ups. The thing that looks like a jar of brown liquid gives you the ability to take 1 hit without dying. First boss is a rather scary looking witch. With the power-up sword, however, this goes by pretty quickly. And you do also get a great death animation on the witch. Captain Silver is not a terribly long game, 6 levels of the boss at the end of each. The second level is a pirate ship with a pirate boss. But here's the thing, this is the version that was released in Japan and Europe. For the US release, the game was literally cut in half. The US card is 1 meg versus 2. 2 entire levels were removed, almost all the bosses, several types of enemies were cut out. The US Captain Silver is much shorter and much easier. After finishing the original version of the game, this one here, I tried playing the US version, and you can sleepwalk through the thing in like 10-15 minutes. Most of the projectile throwing enemies are gone, so you can just sort of slash your way through the game. Here's one boss missing from the US game. He's difficult because it takes just so many darn hits to kill him. It's easy to jump over his fireballs, but because this just goes on and on, there's a chance of you slipping up as your attention wanes. Here's another level that was much easier in the US version. Watch out for the coconuts. The hit detection I think is somewhat questionable at times, but it's usually in your favor. It's certainly much improved over the arcade game, which is quite unfair at times. Remember, most of Captain Silver's difficulty comes from the fact that there's no life bar. You have one-hit deaths. This makes a few bosses quite difficult. Speaking of which, we have that one boss, the banana guy. The guy who makes you want to throw your controller on the ground and jump on it. To damage this guy, you have to touch him directly with your sword. The projectiles won't hurt him. Only his feet and head are unprotected. So you need to get right up in front of him while he's slowly advancing and hitting at you with a flail. He'll raise his arm when he does a high flail attack, but the low attacks are much more unexpected. And he'll corner you at the edge of the screen, and you can't jump over him. If you had a life bar, he would just be pretty easy, but the fact that one mistake kills you makes him really like an exercise in frustration. I wouldn't call it a game breaker, but you'll like Captain Silver a lot less because of this one guy. So after some platforming, which is thankfully rare in this game, you encounter Captain Silver himself. He's a bit tricky because he throws very fast projectiles at you, and if you don't plan accordingly, you can get trapped by him at the edge of the screen. You need to jump over the fireballs and land close enough to run underneath him the next time he jumps. Finally, we get the actual treasure of Captain Silver, some enormous rings and gold coins. Then you get an illustrated epilogue, once again missing from the US release. So I'd say Captain Silver falls into the surprisingly enjoyable category. It's much better than the Master System Rygar, and I found it more fun than Lord of the Sword. While it can't compare to some of the better NES games like Contra, Bionic Commando, in terms of slickness, on the Master System this is one of the better games. Certainly an improvement over the arcade game, and better than the Famicom port, which we'll encounter a few episodes from now. Now this is surprising. All of a sudden Sega is getting ports of non-Sega arcade games. This is Final Bubble Bobble, first Taito developed game on the Master System, though Sega actually published it. Despite the weird name, it's just a regular port of good old Bubble Bobble. Even has a little arcade-style demo mode. This was also released in Europe under the name Bubble Bobble and in Brazil as Dragon Maze, not released in the US. As we know, this originally hit arcades in 1986, sort of a deliberately old-school style video game at a time when arcade games were getting more and more elaborate. An NES port came out in Japan for 1987, so let's do sort of like a comparison here. When we fire up the NES version, one thing we'll notice is that the intro is missing the background stars. Colors are a little off for one. The enemies look a little weird when they get trapped in the bubbles. And by comparison, the Master System version has brighter colors and more detail in the sprites. It's not quite pixel perfect, but it's definitely more accurate than the Nintendo version, and it just somehow feels a bit more like the arcade game. I'm not really sure why this never came out in the US. I assume it was due to Nintendo of America's restrictions regarding games appearing on competing platforms. Now unfortunately for Japanese Master System owners, this was the only Taito game released for the console in that territory. It might seem a bit odd, as the Master System release schedule in Japan seems pretty robust at this point. 5 games came out in July 1988, but in reality, the system was getting ready to wind up. The Japanese Master System was getting ready to have one last blaze of glory in fall 1988, whereas in the West, it was actually starting to pick up a bit. We actually have another Taito game coming up soon that was only released in the West, never came out in Japan. So anyway, as for Final Bubble Bobble, it's definitely the better of the 2 home versions we've seen so far.